Thank you very much for joining today. My name is Stephen Helm. I'm a product marketing manager here at WatchGuard Technologies. We're going to talk about defeating ransomware with unified security and really how WatchGuard is approaching unified security and really tackling the issue of ransomware across our portfolio. Before we get into the actual content, just some housekeeping notes for everybody on the call today. There's two ways to actually listen to the call. You can use your computer dial in, or you can do the telephone dial in, right? So if you have any issues with the computer, the connection gets a little fuzzy, something like that, maybe you want to jump to the dial in and just use your phone to call in. We do have a Q&A box in the right-hand side of your screen. You can feel free to ask questions as we go through the presentation. I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the presentation, and if not, I can reach out to you after the call and hopefully respond to any questions. We will record and share this webinar. It will be available online. And these webinars, all WatchGuard webinars, are eligible for continuing professional education credits. So if you're interested in those, you can apply and use this session to satisfy those requirements. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation today. And I wanted to start with, I think, a really daunting story, and that's one that probably everybody on the call has at least become a little bit aware of in the last couple of weeks and months, and that's the breach of KNP Logistics Group. Now, not a large company, an organization based out of the United Kingdom, obviously logistics, so shipping, trucking type of organization. But the thing that's really interesting and I think salient for our conversation is this is an organization that had been in business for 158 years, a legacy organization in the United Kingdom, right? And unfortunately, KNP collapsed and had to close their business as the result of a ransomware attack. And that attack started when attackers guessed a single credential, so a single username password combination to allow them to get within KNP's environment and start to encrypt data and then ultimately issue a ransom demand demanding millions of dollars. And so the gang of hackers believed to be behind this is known as Akira. And again, they targeted KNP in part because they had access or because they could use that brute force capability to get into this organization. And KNP, right, they had some cyber protections. They had invested in about €1 million of a cyber insurance policy, but ultimately the ransom demand was estimated at over €5 million for KNP. And just like many organizations of their size, right, less than 1,000 overall employees, sort of that mid to small market organization, a $5 million price tag popping up in the middle of your year is very difficult to weather. So this is something they couldn't handle. And ultimately, they weren't able to get their data back and resume operations, right? And they ended up having to enter administration and laid off nearly 700 people. And so I've been in cybersecurity for around 15 years, right? And stories like this are ones that we've always sort of guessed at and hazarded at, this impact of a ransomware attack shuttering legacy businesses. But we're really starting to see that come to fruition now. KNP is not alone. We've seen similar types of attacks to businesses in the past few years, and we should expect this will only escalate. And so that really brings us to the presentation, what we're going to talk about for the next hour or so. And we'll start off with what's different about ransomware today, some of the things that have changed. We'll look at what the WatchGuard Threat Lab team has discovered and how they're seeing some of these things shift and what that implication means for you. We'll talk about some high-level key strategies for surviving ransomware, right? Basically, if you're looking at defending your business today, you can't rely on a single layer of security. So we want to discuss that and give you some ways to think about it going forward. And part of that will be teeing up this idea of the cyber defense matrix, a framework that'll help you understand really where to map your security layers, where there's value, and potentially where there's gaps. And then we'll talk about how WatchGuard really brings those security layers together, unifies those security layers. So not only are you getting layered protection, you're getting an intelligent layered protection that the layers communicate with each other for more effective security. And we call that our unified security platform. So we'll sort of finish up the discussion talking about that platform and a little bit of a vision for what that means going forward. And then at the end here, we'll leave a little bit of time for questions and answers. So with that, let's keep going. So what's the difference about ransomware today? What's changed, right? One of the big things that the WatchGuard Threat Lab team has discovered in our most recent internet security report that we released a couple of weeks ago is that attackers are now shifting towards data theft instead of encryption. Part of this is driven by improvements in data backups, recovery capabilities, just this idea that if files are encrypted and that's the means of ransom, that there's chances now that that could be recovered, backed up, and things if the victim organization has put those things in place. So threat actors are starting to evolve their approach to ransomware, and part of that is they're approaching these attacks using multiple vectors. They're using multiple stages to escalate, to infiltrate, and to move about an environment. And then they're using multiple payloads, right? So again, not just a crypto ransomware that's encrypting the data, but something that's also exfiltrating data or potentially even taking additional stages and additional attack capabilities. You're also seeing a lot more double and triple extortion, right? If you're successful breaking into an organization, this makes sense, right? You're going to want to maximize the impact against this victim. And so part of that could be, hey, we're going to encrypt your data, but then we might also exfiltrate that data and then try and either sell it or blackmail you to say, if you don't give us additional funds, we will sell this data or put it on the dark web. And then even the triple extortion, right? Maybe you have an attack where you're doing some type of DDoS capability on top of the other elements of the attack to, again, bring that organization to its knees and cripple their ability to deliver their services. And then downtime and reputational damage. These are really the biggest costs now. It used to be that we kind of get our eyes bugged out when we'd see the ransom demands themselves. But organizations now recognize just how severe the impact of a lot of these attacks has been. They're attacking things like backups and cloud stores, right? So the ability to respond, to get back to good order is that much more daunting today than it's ever been. And so these are just some of the areas where ransomware has sort of changed from its genesis, 10, 15 years ago. And that brings us to this idea of the impact of ransomware and how we should start to think about it within our organization, right? And obviously, it's not a new discussion. Ransomware, again, has been around for over a decade, and today drives around $20 billion in global damages annually. And so when you look at what those damages look like, right, it's not just the ransomware payment, which can be severe, but it's ultimately the cost of downtime, that organization's inability to serve customers in front of them. If you're a hospital having to cancel appointments and move patients to other locations, right? Whatever the impact of your inability to operate could be. The recovery costs, right? If you don't have data and backups and those capabilities, or let's just say the team behind the scenes to be able to take on this burden of bringing your systems back into good order, the cost and the time associated with that. And then things like reputational costs, right? Especially as we're talking about some of those double extortion, triple extortion examples where that data that's being stolen and ransomed is potentially going to be pushed for sale on the deep web, the dark web. Right? What is the impact to your reputation on those types of things? And again, the downtime, right? If you're unable to serve the customer in front of you and serve your community, what is that impact on your business reputation overall? And these things ultimately are very, very difficult to calculate and put a fine figure behind for an organization. But it's just important to understand the total impact that we're really talking about when we talk about ransomware. And that brings us to an example of a modern ransomware breach. And this is an example that I sort of put together, an example that's based on the general examples that are available in the market, right? Sort of amalgamized into one story here, if you will. And this is much more sophisticated than even the one I described in KMP, where it was a simple, guessed or brute forced password that allowed them through the front door, right? And so in this example, right, you have a fake Microsoft security alert emails. We've probably all seen these. It goes out to our users saying, oh, there's some new security change organization needs to make you aware of, or in this instance, it's we noticed someone tried to use your credentials, log in to assure it's you, or whatever that looks like. And basically, three users were tricked into logging into a fraudulent Microsoft 365 page. And this allowed attackers to steal the valid credentials from these users, right? Because they're entering the credential right into that interface. And through this process, they were actually able to steal the session token, which allowed them to bypass multi-factor authentication going forward. And from there, they installed a malicious OAuth app, and this allowed them to maintain persistence, right? Allowed them to actually facilitate those MFA challenges, help them move about the environment, and ultimately facilitated privilege escalation into different portions and areas of the environment. And from there, attackers could start scraping emails, they could capture Teams chats, right? Steal SharePoint documents, and move laterally to the more sensitive areas of the environment. So things like the HR files, customer files, legal areas, sensitive legal documents, right? And the impact is that they were able to exfiltrate 1.9 terabytes of sensitive data and then dropped a ransomware payload, locking those synced local folders across employee devices and going after some of those cloud stores as well. And so, this is just again an example of what's possible with a multi-payload, sophisticated attack. And ultimately, this victim only became aware, like many victims do, when that ransomware demand was first issued to someone, right? When that pop-up shows up on the screen and says, "Look, all your files are locked. Here's what you need to do to get them back," right? And this is not the end, too, right? An attack like this would have significant impact on things like FTC investigations, potential lawsuits, those types of things. And so an attack like this would be significant and ongoing as far as the recovery, not even just from a technical standpoint. And the estimated cost for an attack like this would be around $5.2 million, which is roughly the average of ransomware attacks that we see in the market today. And one of the things I want to point out here is I have this boom that I've called out, this point where the attacker has actually gotten into the environment. They've used those valid stolen credentials, and now they have access. And this is a concept we're going to be talking about in the presentation as we go forward. So some key strategies for surviving ransomware, and some of these, obviously, would be a little bit obvious, so to speak, right? The first one being ransomware. Stop ransomware before it starts with layered protection. You want to do whatever you can to close the security gaps, the risks that you have in your environment, to have that proactive protection against ransomware. Having that good hygiene capability is an essential first step, and we'll talk about that going forward. Then unifying layers to contain the blast radius quickly. There's this idea of dwell time, right? In the presentation or the slide I was just sharing, once they got within that environment, they lingered for around 5 days before they started to do the data exfiltration, before they started to do the data encryption, right? And so being able to find those activities and ultimately minimize that blast radius by detecting these activities earlier is very important. And then finally, deploying security that learns and evolves over time. We happen to live in a time where artificial intelligence has really come to fruition. It certainly has a stake in the cybersecurity arena. And now our systems can be that much more intelligent and make much more sense out of raw data that we're seeing from our security layers. And if we can use that to evolve our security posture over time and make it sort of an intelligent system, that is going to help us protect our businesses going forward. So we'll talk about that and some of the ways WatchGuard is doing that throughout the presentation. So surviving cyber, there's this idea of the left of boom and the right of boom, and you may have heard of this concept before. But things that are to the left of boom are these sort of pre-event things that we undertake, right? These efforts we do to reduce the likelihood of our organization falling victim to an attack, right? And this starts with having clear structural awareness of our environment, right? So things like cyber hygiene, understanding where we might be a little lax in our approaches to cybersecurity, right? Finding misconfigurations and patches that are outdated, doing vulnerability assessments, and then doing things like baselining what normal looks like, using things like artificial intelligence to get a really solid snapshot for a period of time what that organization's normal traffic or behaviors across endpoints looks like. Right, having that awareness is very important. And the good thing here is this is a lot of where organizations have invested time and investment and money so far, because you can rely on a lot of technology here to get you to where you need to be. But as you move to the right and you move for the right of boom, so to speak, right, where now you're more focused on situational awareness, understanding what's actively happening within your environment so you can reduce the impact of an attack, of a breach. That's what we mean by the right of boom here. And that means post-event types of actions, finding the bad guys, using log data and things to improve your understanding of what's going on in the environment, triggering on unexpected state changes. So I talked about that baselining normal. Now this idea we can use that baseline to find anomalies, right? And so, this is an area where you have to really, the further right you go, right, have to rely more on your people and your expertise, right? And so WatchGuard, this is where we take a lot of pride in developing simple, effective tools for small security teams, where that people burden is a little bit less than what you'd see in our competitive space. So we'll talk about that going forward. And so when we look at this from a capability standpoint, right, and we take that same left and right of boom and we start to apply capabilities, here's what that looks like, right? You'll see I've actually added endpoint or users and identities, devices and endpoints, and networks and clouds. For our discussion today, those are the security layers that we're going to be talking about throughout the presentation. And hopefully that will be become clear why we're focusing there as we go forward. But each one of these layers has a story to tell across identifying threats, protecting against threats, detecting ongoing attacks, and responding to those attacks, right? And I have a couple of examples in each one of these blocks that are sort of highlighted that we'll talk about throughout the presentation, right? But these are the things that I think really, if you focus on some of these detections, the ability to use put these protections in place, and some of these responses, puts you in a really good position to be able to detect and respond to ransomware using a unified platform. So we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. And so that really brings us to our first security layer, and that's endpoints and devices, right? And I think it's an important place to start when we talk about ransomware in general, because a lot of organizations, this is where they've spent the most of their investment, the most of their time, and I'll add, is perhaps the most significant burden for managing some of their cybersecurity, and that's endpoint security, right? Endpoints are ultimately really that front line for a lot of your cybersecurity, right? Each device that your user has or your environment has is a potential a doorway for an attacker, right? It's an expansion of the attack surface. And all of these devices vary in their role, right? Whether they're an endpoint machine for a user or maybe potentially an IoT device, right? Their security capabilities are very different depending on what those device types are. And so understanding that, all it really takes is one endpoint that could be essentially that patient zero for introducing something like ransomware into your environment. That really, I think, speaks to the importance of focusing on endpoint and why people invest there. And one of the things to note here is, 3 out of 4 of the applications that we're seeing on these endpoints have existing security flaws. So it's about some of the software that are running on these devices and having the ability to find those weaknesses and misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, right? 84% of companies have high-risk vulnerabilities in their software stacks running on these endpoints, and 60% of these cyber attacks are tied to unpatched known vulnerabilities. So, although we're relying on endpoint security tools, very often the configuration of these devices and the applications running on these devices is a key and acute point of weakness. And I'd also point out that we've seen on our Threat Lab report that there's a shift where we're seeing less malicious scripts for being the preferred delivery method for things like ransomware. And we're seeing a return to more of that drive-by download tactic, where they're exploiting your users who are potentially downloading tools or software, remote software, and things that they shouldn't be, right? So just something to be aware of how the the attackers are sort of shifting their approach. And so that brings us to WatchGuard's endpoint security, right? If you're not familiar with WatchGuard and our endpoint security stack, we offer a number of different tools, everything all the way down from what we call our EPP, which is a bit of an enhanced antivirus approach, all the way up to what we call our advanced EPDR tool. And overall, WatchGuard today protects around 4 million endpoints across Windows, Linux, and Mac, right? So a very full-featured, broad coverage endpoint detection and response capability. It has response not just for malware and files and payloads, but also things like in-memory attacks, living off the land types of attacks. Uses very sophisticated behavioral analysis and detection, right, to find things like scripts and macros. And it also has things like built-in URL filtering, device control, and a managed firewall. And the thing that's really nice about how we approach endpoint security at WatchGuard is we use one lightweight agent for all of our endpoint security tools, right? So if you had a user who you secured with EPP and you want them to upgrade to an EPDR service later, you can do that without having to install a new endpoint solution. Pretty much just turn that capability on right from your WatchGuard cloud management interface. And as you can see here, we call the endpoint security stack really provides coverage across your prevention, your detection, as well as your response. And there's this element of lessons learned, right, where we're actually feeding some of the things we've detected, and I'll talk about this in more detail as we go forward, back into our understanding and our prevention mechanisms as well. So it's sort of learning from detections as we go forward. And so what makes our EDR technology unique, right? If you're, have an EDR today, or you're considering one, why would you look at WatchGuard, especially in the context of ransomware, which, as we've described, can be very severe and impactful for businesses of all sizes, right? The big thing that we have that I think differentiates us from other EDRs in the market is what we call our zero trust application service. We're the only EDR provider that has this. The zero trust application service classifies 100% of unknown applications and processes before they're allowed to run on a device. So this is a feature of our most advanced endpoint security tool, our advanced EPDR capability. And the way this works is we have an artificial intelligence system that automatically classifies all known and unknown applications as they're arriving on these endpoints and before they can execute. And if that AI can't establish this as a known good or a known bad, it'll actually kick over to WatchGuard experts, so actual human beings behind the scenes who will do this process of classification, right? And it typically takes only a few minutes to get that response back and be able to, have access to that application or know that it's blocked as a result of it. And so there's no burden for your team to have to do this, right? Again, it's something that AI and our team at WatchGuard handles automatically. And what we've seen is that 3 out of every 1,000 unknown files typically tends to be some new malware variant. So it's a very, very impactful and strong way to prevent any type of ransomware attack from running on your device. And it's unique to what WatchGuard provides with our EDR capability. And so we talked about patching a little bit as well. So one thing I want you to understand is that when we talk about patching, it isn't just about finding what patches are available and what should be applied to different devices. It's about how quickly can you do those things, right? And so we have a patching capability at WatchGuard that helps us accelerate that as part of our endpoint product. And we've seen that 75% of vulnerabilities are exploited within 19 days. And 38 days is essentially what it requires, is the time that it takes a vendor to deploy a patch to an environment. And from there, it takes over 60 days as a mean time to patch for the average organization to apply those patches from vendors, right? So there's a significant lag time between when vulnerabilities are found, when patches are developed, and also between when patches are developed and when we see organizations to deploy those. And what that means is threat actors have this time to infiltrate and use those vulnerabilities and exploit them before you're patched. So really being able to detect where you need to patch and be able to apply those patches very quickly is important as part of defending against ransomware. And WatchGuard, as I said, has a patch management solution that does just that. We have a lot more details on our website. I won't spend a lot of time here, but essentially it keeps systems and applications right free from vulnerabilities with minimal overhead, right? No interruption to your team. It has all the versions, updated versions of Windows, updated for hundreds of third-party applications, right? It's going to scan and give you a good assessment of where there's gaps and where there's available patches that need to be applied, and put this right within our WatchGuard Cloud interface as part of our unified platform. So it makes it very intuitive. So again, that's one of the endpoint security modules that we have available. I think is very important for ransomware specifically. And one final point here on endpoint security, right, is our integration with our ThreatSync XDR tool. We have an XDR tool that's part of WatchGuard Cloud, included with all of our various security layers that we offer, and allows us to correlate across those layers and find threats and even learn from things that we detect across those environments. And so I'm showing an example here of what that looks like, where we have our dashboard for the ThreatSync endpoint detections, right? And you can see each detection is scored. They're listed by priority. You have a list of all of the incidents over a period of time that endpoint has fallen victim to, right? And then if you dig in to some of those events, you can get even more detail, right? What was the account? When was it last updated? But most importantly, you can actually take action just in a matter of clicks here, right from this detection, right? And so you can see here, I can delete the file, I can isolate the device, right? I can kill the process, and it can even take remote control right from WatchGuard Cloud to intercede on an infection, again, because of our endpoint detection and response and our ThreatSync XDR integration. So now let's talk a little bit about identities and where identities come into play as we talk about ransomware attacks. And I started out the presentation with an example where the victims really fell victim because of a brute force password guessing attempt, where the threat actor either had access to a password already, or the victim themselves used a fairly easy to guess password, or they used some other tool to help that brute force process. And so this really speaks to the vulnerability of credentials, right? The credential being that key to identifying users, right? And typically this is a username and a password, but it's additional things as well now, right? And a lot of the exposure that we see includes things today like phone numbers, which is important for smishing and phishing attacks, where you might want to use that device to help facilitate the phishing attack against your victim. And so these credentials ultimately allow an attacker to essentially become you within the environment if they're stolen. And the mindset has changed here a little bit around credentials, right? NIST used to only recommend, we used to recommend that you rotate passwords, let's say 60, 90, whatever that cadence was. NIST now recommends only changing passwords when you have evidence that the credential has been stolen, right? And so this is where things like proactive monitoring of the dark web can help you identify some of those things and know when you should advise your users to rotate. And this is a big challenge, right? The average user has 25 to 85 credentials. 40% of ransomware attacks access the environment because of a compromised credential, and 71% of attacks year over year, increasing, use these stolen credentials. So credentials is, again, an acute point of weakness that ransomware threat actors really exploit. And so the tip here is fairly straightforward. Again, multi-factor authentication is absolutely critical if you're going to be serious about defending your organization against ransomware. And I believe multi-factor authentication should be deployed across all of your users, and no matter what size of organization you are today. I think it's that important for security. And so obviously beyond the password, something it's something you have, a device, something you are, potentially biometrics, and then potentially something you do, like a push challenge. And so that's powerful, right? But as I gave the example earlier, there are methods to exploit MFA, especially if the MFA provider you're using doesn't have some of the capabilities to detect things like changes in their access locations and things, more sophisticated detection capabilities behind the scenes. And so that's why it's important to have the ability to find signs of credential compromise, right? So having MFA, yes, but then the ability to flag, let's say, repeated login attempts with incorrect passwords, finding too many failed authentications where a token is used, maybe where the user has disabled security features of their MFA, right? Authentications are being denied by policy, but they're still being issued and challenged, right? All of these types of activities across your user accounts can be signs of a compromised credential, a compromised account, and you want to make your larger security platform and the other security layers within your environment potentially aware of this, right? So you can intercede and prevent a larger escalation to an attack. And so really this is what WatchGuard allows you to do with our off-point multi-factor authentication solution today. Won't spend a lot of time here because I think MFA, hopefully you're familiar with it, but we have a mobile app, we have hardware tokens, single sign-on, very feature-rich application portal, and again, all managed from WatchGuard Cloud and our larger unified security platform today. And one of the things I wanted to focus on for this presentation, because it's new or fairly new to this audience, is the ability to monitor the dark web for breach credentials. And so what we have is our dark web credential monitoring service. It monitors for user credentials 24/7 across the dark web, deep web, surface web, and P2P networks. So not just the dark web, right? And when it finds a credential that's exposed, it'll alert the user, right? It's not going to expose their information. It's not going to expose their password or anything sensitive. It'll just say, hey, your credentials have been detected within this breach environment. And you can even set it so your operators are also informed. So let's say one of your users is breached, you can get flagged to say, oh, there's a compromised user. And again, no more details than that could be potentially sensitive, but allows you to actually have that visibility. And as you can see here, right in the WatchGuard Cloud database or dashboard, we have the last reported breach visibility, right? So you can see exactly by user, token by token, right? And even across those groups, where their last breach was, what that breach exactly was, right? And it makes it very easy to make sense of really quickly. The other thing to note here, really this tool uses the deepest data lake for dark web search engines, right? So very strong data sourcing here and artificial intelligence behind the scenes to make this efficient and up to date for you. So, again, I think a very powerful tool to have in place. And as I mentioned earlier, now that NIST is saying don't rotate unless you have evidence as a breach, this is a great tool to say, hey, we discovered that you were breached on this time. Maybe you want to go through that password rotation process. And then just bringing us to sort of wrap up the identity portion of the presentation, and that's how AuthPoint and ThreatSync XDR integrates together. And so ThreatSync is actually going to take information from AuthPoint events, alerts, and activities, and actually do some of that correlation I talked about on the earlier slide, right? It's going to find those risky, access attempts. So these are our defaults I have sort of in the middle here, but an example of 10 incorrect password attempts, that would be something flagged, and you could adjust that to maybe be 5 or whatever is more appropriate. Things like 7 or more push notifications within 10 minutes. All these things that are dynamic assessments of the actual behaviors of your users trying to log in that are then communicated to ThreatSync so you can actually intercede and take action there. So you see on the left-hand side here an example of exactly what that looks like within the ThreatSync platform. Here's an authentication policy violation where somebody has violated a policy that we had in place, and it's now coming to you and saying, what do you want to do with this, right? You could do this automatically by policy, but in this instance, we can block the user, or we can even block the attacker's IP address, right? If we think very confidently that that's a an attacker issuing these requests, right? And again, one click to do these things right from the ThreatSync platform and right from that tool. And that brings us to our network security part of the presentation. And the thing I want you to understand here is that cyber attackers really must traverse your network in some way to be successful. WatchGuard, we've been in the firewall business for many, many years. Firewalls have been one of the real legacy security tools. So I think there's an inclination that network security maybe does not provide the value that it maybe once did. That is absolutely not the case, because again, attackers have to traverse these pathways to be effective. So blocking malicious traffic, segmenting networks, detecting threats as they move about your network, right, ensures you can catch those threats very early. And really, if you don't have network protection, ultimately hackers have free reign within your environment here. So network security is still very, very critical. And we'll talk about some of the ways we've evolved our offering at WatchGuard to capture that important visibility for you. And the first one is really one you're probably most familiar with WatchGuard, and that's our fireboxes. A WatchGuard firebox firewalls, they scan around 1 billion security scans every hour, right? There are 15 layers of defense to block advanced threats and ransomware. I talk about this as like your traffic is running the gauntlet, inbound and outbound traffic is running the gauntlet of all of these different security layers. Things from gateway antivirus, which is basically a signature-based detection, all the way down to our APT blocker detection capability, which is a sandbox, right, that allows you to take files, push those files to the cloud sandbox, have that file execute, run within a controlled environment, and analyze it as it's actually active there. And then from there, can share what it discovered out with to the other parts of your security layers as part of our unified security platform and as part of our XDR approach. So very powerful firewall capabilities with those security layers. But I think what's most compelling that we've released really in the last 18 months, and hopefully you're familiar with, is our network detection and response solution. So if you're not familiar with network detection and response, it's essentially a cloud-based solution that overlays your entire network, right? So it's going to be able to look at that traffic that traverses your firewalls, entering your network, leaving your network as your users go about their business. But then it also finds what we call east-west traffic, and that's the traffic that's moving internally from system to system, moving across routers, moving across switches, right? And so what network detection and response will do is create a baseline of everything that's happening within your network, right? Typically, this takes around a 2-week period, finding all the types of connection patterns and behavior, again, both inbound and outbound and internal to that network. And from that baseline, it flags and alerts and finds threats based on anomalies within those traffic patterns. And the output of that is you get 24/7 coverage and risk and threat monitoring for your entire network, right? It's something that very intelligently can monitor what's happening and flag those concerns. It also has visibility to all of the devices on your network. And this is a critical one. We talked about some of the endpoint security and how different devices have different security capabilities. Well, with this, you can see all the traffic leaving your devices and communicating with your devices very clearly, and also identify and tag those devices. So things like IoT devices and things that are potentially non-Windows or typical operating system devices, you can be sure that they're not trying to reach out to malicious areas of the internet or do some type of malicious activity on your network with that visibility. And ultimately, NDR helps detect active attacks that have bypassed perimeter and endpoint security. And one of the key elements that we provide as part of our network detection and response solution is a policy engine. And this allows you to map security and network policies to things like regulatory controls. And I'll explain where there's value to that as we go forward here a little bit. And so you might be saying, okay, well, why do I need network detection and response if I have a firewall? And so just to put a little bit of a finer point on this, right? A firewall, like a WatchGuard firebox, is really meant to block threats from entering and leaving the network. That's really the concept behind the wall, right? And so a firebox, as an example, has that full arsenal of scanning engines I just talked about that you can subject that traffic to, that north-south traffic to. But when you talk about network detection and response, really you're talking about detecting and killing hidden threats inside of the network. And this is all about reducing dwell time, right? And cutting dwell time often from weeks to a matter of hours with the technology like I'm talking about here. And that, again, is because we have that baseline that we've established and we're able to flag those anomalies. Also should call out here that it's the same engine is able to catch misconfigured rules and novel attacks that could potentially be slipping by that firewall. And if you're a WatchGuard firewall user today, understand that NDR would require no new hardware. If you already have a firebox in place, the firebox actually acts as that sensor for your north-south traffic, which makes the integration of NDR into your environment very easy and really can save you a lot of costs compared to some of the competitive solutions in the market. And again, the ThreatSync plus NDR tool is a very sophisticated artificial intelligence tool. And so that baseline process I talked about, this is really what that ultimately looks like, right? It's a self-learning artificial intelligence system that brings policies that you establish and something that we have some pre-configured best practices policies around, as well as additional context that takes billions of network flows and really give you a very clear ranked shortlist of where your security concerns lie in your network. And so another way to look at this is we take around 3 billion flows from the average typical organization's network traffic, and we distill those down into around 3 daily smart alerts. And our process is through a process of collecting that raw information, those raw flows from your network, enriching it with intelligence, performing detections and correlations, and then using AI to actually take that last mile of investigation. And this is something a lot of the NDR tools in the market don't do. They're generating way more alerts and having your team make sense of it. We're doing that last mile of investigation so you get a manageable amount of daily alerts out of your environment that you can very confidently handle here. And so you see on the right-hand side some of the examples here. I have smart alerts for very sophisticated attacks that have been flagged. You have the device scoring that we've identified devices and then applied a risk score. And then some of the visualizations around behaviors that are part of this tool. And I've mentioned that there's a very sophisticated policy engine behind the scenes with our ThreatSync plus NDR tool. And one of the nice things that we can do here as it relates to ransomware is take that policy engine and run reports against it. And so apply this policy engine and run a report against your network to understand how your security posture aligns with best practices from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, right? So we have a network defense goal report and a ransomware defense goal report, again, that you can use our AI system to run across your environment and give you a very accurate viewing of your network and cloud security posture against ransomware using our ThreatSync plus NDR tool. And this is something that if you want to take a look at or even potentially have WatchGuard or one of your partners run this against your environment, reach out to us. We'd be happy to engage and show you where maybe we can add some value there. And just another way to look at this, right? We talked about ThreatSync XDR, but with our ThreatSync Plus tools, we're adding a tremendous amount of detection capability specifically around ransomware to what's possible, right? And so, you see these unified detections where we're taking these specific relevant smart alerts, things like anonymous file activity, horizontal port scanning, RDP tunneling, right? That we're able to surface and identify using ThreatSync Plus. and we're able to bring this over to our ThreatSync core, our ThreatSync XDR engine, right, and see this all from a single threats dashboard, and then take response actions against this. So, we're really adding a lot of detection capability with our ThreatSync Plus AI tools to our ransomware detections. And ultimately, all of these tools come together under our unified security platform. And so that's our tool that really is built on WatchGuard Cloud, our cloud management tool for every security layer I've talked about throughout the presentation. It's your one-stop shop for managing, maintaining, right, doing all your reporting and inventory management, all of that from the cloud with our WatchGuard Cloud interface. It provides that single pane of glass across 3 different solutions, including that ThreatSync XDR, threats dashboard. It simplifies deployment and also is ultimately built for zero trust approaches, which we have a very strong story with that integrated user identity or multi-factor authentication, as well as endpoint and network security capabilities. So, delivering this all as one unified platform really sets up smaller teams for success and makes it easier for them to manage their security in the face of some of these very aggressive ransomware attacks. And I think, just to put a finer point on this, right, WatchGuard ultimately believes XDR is the future of cybersecurity, right? We've invested a lot of energy and effort into our platform in building our ThreatSync XDR tool to enable smaller security teams to get the full view of what's happening within their environment, respond very confidently, and do things to stop attacks before real damage occurs. And so, you're getting that better visibility, simplified security, right? And the great thing about what we do, because we're so committed to XDR as ultimately the future of what we're doing here, is that our ThreatSync XDR tool is actually included with WatchGuard Cloud. So if you were to purchase any of the solutions I talked about, the endpoint security or Authpoint or network security firewall, something like that, WatchGuard Cloud would actually bring the ThreatSync capabilities to you, so you can do some of those cross-product correlations and see a really unified view of your most concerning security actions within your environment. And so, you might be saying, well, why XDR versus another approach like security information and event management, like the SIM tools, right? And so, we've done a little bit we actually did a webinar on this very topic a few weeks ago. So if this is something that you want to learn more about, I encourage you to check that out. But the way we really view it is that XDR is best for the small teams who want to reduce dwell time and respond faster, right? They both provide threat detection, correlation, security alerting, right? Some cross-platform integration. But when we're talking about those SIM tools, which are often very expensive and complex, especially for smaller teams, these are best for organizations with very strict compliance and forensic retention needs, who also have a large team or a large SOC able to manage those things. So that just gives you a little bit of specificity on why we think XDR is the approach more appropriate for the smaller teams, the lean teams, as opposed to a large SIM investment. Okay, just the difference being that compliance need and forensic retention predominantly. And so, we've talked a lot about unifying these layers, but I just want to call, a point to how actual organizations are using ThreatSync today, right? And we've seen organizations who have said, they've cut their incident management time in half, right? Here's an organization where they had 250 clients, 1,200 endpoints that they were actually managing, right? So a pretty decent deployment there. And with our ThreatSync tool, they now had one single dashboard, all of their threats across those different clients and endpoints, prioritized, scored, and it put in such a way that they can click in and actually take immediate action or respond by policy automatically, right? And they've said that it's cut their time managing these incidents in half, and they haven't had to take on any additional headcount as they've scaled and started to take on more and more endpoints and more environments as they've grown. And again, they have that integration already with the network endpoint and identity security, again, adding more of that value here. So it's very impactful for a lot of our customers today. And if we take a step back and we look at where we sort of started the presentation, that cyber defense matrix, and look at really what WatchGuard is doing here, hopefully you can start to see where we're providing a lot of coverage and capability, right? You know, our off-point solution covers really identify, protect, detect, and respond, as well as our endpoint security, all the way to recovery, which we didn't really talk about, but the idea that we'll have shadow copy images that we can use to recover some of these endpoints. Our Firebox and our NDR solutions covering the same for networks and cloud, right? But then overlaying that is our ThreatSync XDR capability, which gives you that unified detection and response, really where you can respond across those layers, detect across those layers from a unified tool and dashboard that makes it very streamlined and effective, again, for those smaller teams. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that we might have. I know that there is only a couple minutes left here. Let me see what we have from a question standpoint here. Questions, one question. Are there any plans to add a SIM platform or allow third-party SIM integration with WatchGuard Cloud? So we should be able to support through APIs certain third-party SIM integration already. We do integrate with a lot of the leading SIMs. Our plan, at least to my knowledge, is not to bring on board an additional SIM tool at this point in time for the reasons I described. But we really view that for our core market, the smaller teams, right, an XDR tool that does a lot of the heavy lifting, the integration, right, all those capabilities for you, we believe will be more effective in keeping your business safe than some of the SIM tools that are out there. But we certainly understand that there's a need to support those SIM tools for some of those compliance-heavy customers that we have, and we'll continue to build some of those. Okay, well, great. I really appreciate all of your time today. Again, my name is Stephen Helm. I'm on LinkedIn, so if you wanted to add me, reach out to with any questions, shoot me an email. Always happy to respond. Very much appreciate all of your time today, and thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.